Greetings, cats and kittens. This is Erik Nelson, not the usual host of Exploring Santa Cruz, but there's something I want to share with you today, and that's a magical place that exists on our mountains that yours truly just stumbled upon driving up in the mountains one day. I hooked a hard right and went through a fence and went past a magical oak tree, I believe, and came across a place called Quail Hollow. Drove up to this house and, let's just say it was a time portal into the past. And I think this place is the laboratory that forged California and American culture. How's that for a sweeping introduction? And I'm here with the docent, the man who knows everything there is to know about this place, Richard James. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Erik.
And what to say about this is, my first question is, I've been living in Santa Cruz for a long time, in and out for, I hate to admit it, 40 years or so. Why did I just discover it? Am I the only person who doesn't know about this?
No, we hear this story quite often. It's a hidden gem in the mountains. We have even a lot of local folks. Matter of fact, just past Sunday, we had a family from Boulder Creek who had driven by this property for many years and thought it was privately owned and were very hesitant to cross onto the driveway and enter the property. And it was a real revelation to show them around and explain things to them.
And let's talk brief, sort of set up what we're talking about. We're talking about 300 acres?
Quail Hollow Ranch County Park has 300 acres, almost 5 miles of hiking trails. It's also a horse boarding facility. We have horseback riders on trails along with hikers. We don't allow dogs on trails. We don't allow bicycles on trails or motorized vehicles. But it's great if you're walking a trail and behind you hear the clop of hooves, and turn around and step slowly out of the way and allow a horseback rider to pass by.
Now, there's parks. I mean, Henry Cowell, we're blessed with a lot of parks. Big Basin, which will be coming back. Fingers are all crossed. They do that properly. But the thing about Quail Hollow that struck me is this amazing home that's there.
It's a fantastic piece of property in that we've got an original old ranch and farmhouse that's on the property that probably dates back to the original homesteading pioneers, the Kenville family, Joseph and America Kenville, and it's passed through many hands through the years of pioneers. And probably our most notable family that's lived there is the Lane family. Larry and Ruth Lane and their sons, Mel and Bill, were owners and founders of Sunset Magazine. And
we'll talk about Sunset in a bit, because it's a magazine that its time may have passed, but it's still very much out there. But at a certain point, between, say, 1940 to 1970, mid-70s to the 80s, it kind of was California in a way. It set the cultural tone, both for architecture, lifestyle. A certain part of the California dream lived in those pages. And from what I understand, the Lane's house in Quail Hollow was the laboratory for this, literally the laboratory where they would do things in the magazine. They would, grab goodies that came across the door and test them out. They designed their kitchen, the architecture, even though they expanded on this original home. It was done in this sort of dream of what California should be. And if I'm not mistaken, Larry Lane was from Kansas, correct? He wasn't like so many people. He wasn't a native Californian.
No, you're absolutely right, Erik. He was from the Rust Belt, as was his wife Ruth. They both came from those states that were hard in the winter and tough to live in. And actually, Larry Lane worked for Meredith Publishing, which was the magazine that produced Better Homes and Gardens and some other Farmer's Almanac, some other very important of the day magazines. And Larry Lane got the idea that he wanted to start his own magazine and got together a few investors right during the Depression, right in the 20s, and lo and behold, purchased the rights to the name Sunset from Southern Pacific Railway Corporation. It was a handout given to train riders traveling west. Had a little poetry, had a little advertising, and then it would end with, by all means, take Southern Pacific Railway if you're going west. So Larry bought the rights to that magazine and then transformed that into Sunset Magazine. And the original concept, from what I understand, was the magazine was going to be a man's magazine. But Ruth got involved, and there may have been a little more arm twisting than we're allowed to reveal, but the magazine morphed into what we know as more or less a Bible of West Coast living, and that's what the intent was.
But the thing that's great about California and this magazine, there was no California living. They invented it. They made it up. They put together this myth out of the trappings, this natural surroundings of Quail Hollow, of their own idea from the Midwest about this utopia of Santa Cruz could be, and then it kind of said, this is what California is, come on down, people from the Midwest and the rest of the country, when in some ways at the same time Hollywood is establishing its own territory as this mythic, this is what America is in this small way. This is going on at Sunset Boulevard, Sunset Magazine.
You're absolutely right. They were enamored with the temperate climate that they found in California, coming from the Rust Belt states that they did in the 20s. They just fell in love with the temperate climate and realized that that the living standards at that time in California were not up to par with what the potential was. And they opened the door to transform a lot of Californian living into being more of an outdoor type of atmosphere. When you live in a house in California, you should be able to feel like you're outdoors when you're indoors. You should have one homogeneous feeling of your house being with nature and feeling almost like you're outdoors when you're indoors.
Well, Quail Hollow takes the tradition too. I call it the two T's of Santa Cruz, trees and tourism, which have always been inextricable. The industry here was cutting down all the trees they could possibly take out, building roads to get the lumber out. And at the same time, people are coming to these fabulous Victorian hotels on the sea to enjoy the boardwalk and the sun. Because what I understand is in Santa Cruz was they across the bay in Monterey, it's foggier, it's darker, and in Victorian times, that was ideal. Santa Cruz was where the working class would go, or people would go to sit in the sun in their great bathing suits down at the boardwalk, or go up into the mountains to look at whatever trees were left. And then Quail Hollow wasn't a tourist spot. It was a privately owned farm, correct?
That is correct, yeah. It was privately owned by ranchers and farmers right up until 1937 when the Lane family purchased that property. And almost instantly, that property changed its style and what it was to the local area. They turned it originally into their vacation home, but they found themselves spending more and more time in the house on the property. And they basically turned it into what we would probably call today as a dude ranch. They stopped farming, they stopped ranching, they brought in horses, they brought in carriages. They used it as a primary entertainment venue for people that were trying to get to write in the magazine, picking people's brains like special architects to help them with design styles. And they spent a lot of time there, and it was a very graceful type of lifestyle. And it shows when you tour the house and the property. You can imagine probably what it might have been like in the 30s, 40s, and 50s to have that as your domain.
We're here with Richard James, who's the docent and the tour guide, the wizard behind the curtain of Quail Hollow, talking about this amazing little place that any of us can go to. Now, the short form, though, like so much of the arc of California history, the land was ripped off from the Olones Indians who lived here by the Spanish. Then it was ripped off from the Spanish in the 1840s, 1850s. Then the homesteader came in. Who was the first homesteader at Quail Hollow?
First homesteader was Joseph Kenville.
Now, homesteader, folks, is he just shows up and, if you showed up and you plant your stakes, it's yours?
No, that's not how it occurred. He actually came to Santa Cruz a year earlier and started the first freight line from Santa Cruz to haul freight over the hill to Los Gatos and San Jose. And that he made his mark originally doing that in downtown Santa Cruz. And about a year later, he decided he wanted to move out of Santa Cruz, sold that business, and wanted to homestead that property up in Quail Hollow, and discovered it, whether it was on a foray with his family up in the mountains, or word of mouth, or through his church. Some reason occurred that he came to that property and fell in love with it and applied to homestead it. And at the time,
apply to homestead, how does that work? You just say, hey, I'd like to, this is 308 acres, I'd like it.
You have to apply. You applied to the federal government, and for a filing fee, you were given, Joseph was given 44 acres of flat ground, much, much smaller than what the park is today.
That's not unlike real estate today, too. You can
It's
just kind of
very
write and
similar.
say, hey, I'd like to, a couple, an acre of Pasatiempo. Can you let me have it? But I guess not.
Well, times were different. The federal government was trying to open up the West Coast and get more agriculture, more people to move west. So part of this was a giveaway of land, and for a filing fee and a guarantee that you would stay on the property, have a certain amount of livestock, produce a certain amount of crops, you'd be given this land by the Abraham Lincoln administration, basically.
Are any pieces of this railroad or railroads, we forget just how crisscrossed the mountains were, because you can't cut down old growth trees unless you can get them out and get them on boats or send them up to San Francisco to build the city that's going to be burning down in 1906. So, are there any vestiges of that rail left anywhere at Quail Hollow?
Well, not at Quail Hollow necessarily. There is a roadway not far from the property that's currently on someone else's private property that's called the Kenville Road, and it was where a rail stop was put in. Back in the 1870s, Joseph Kenville applied to Southern Pacific to have a rail stop, what's known as a flag stop. He would have his sons or himself flag down a train. They would drop off a boxcar, and he would load produce in that boxcar to be picked up at a later date and then transported over the hill to other places.
Now, is he the watermelon king? Was that one of the crops that were up there?
In 1872, I believe it was, he was declared by the Santa Cruz Agricultural Commission Watermelon King of Santa Cruz County. He grew a large variety of melons, musk melons, watermelons, citron melons, a lot of types of melons that are no longer found around here. He was the king of Santa Cruz County.
So we have royalty in Santa Cruz then. We hosted the king of watermelons and musk melons. So.
Exactly right. He probably didn't receive a crown, but he certainly received a lot of business and had a great input of being able to deliver to many of the burgeoning hotels and restaurants that were forming in the Santa Rosa Valley.
Well, speaking of that, a place I would like to speak, I want to walk through the time portal of Quail Hollow and then head over to Ben Lomond and the Roardian Hotel. I think, is that how you pronounce it?
Roardian, yes.
Yeah. So this joint, think about this in Ben Lomond, ladies and gentlemen. It boasted a large dance hall for social entertainment, dancing concerts, a regular orchestra, a new clubhouse that cost the then astronomical $4,000, and croquet, tennis courts, golf links, boating, swimming, everything, and it could be had for a stay of $14 a week. But this is the trip I'd like to do. If more variety was desired, guests could ride a stage from Ben Lomond to Santa Cruz, enabling them the chance to see the beautiful San Lorenzo Canyon, spend several hours in Santa Cruz on the beach, and return for dinner at the hotel. So sign me up. I don't know about that $14 a week. It's a little rich for my blood. But the idea that this infrastructure was up in the mountains supporting this now lost industry, in some ways the clock has been turned back. There's been development, but there's been de-development, don't you think, in some ways? These places aren't around anymore.
You're right. You're absolutely right to a degree. And as a matter of fact, you can still find vestiges of that old Hotel Roardian in Ben Lomond. There's an antique store called Town and Country Antiques, and they actually are in the dance hall of the old hotel. That's the last remaining vestige of that hotel. That hotel on the corner of Glen Arbor and Highway 9 in Ben Lomond encompassed 300 acres. And it had lakes, canals, canoes. I mean, it was a vast, as large as our park, as large as Quail Hollow Park. And it was just an amazing piece of entertainment, probably, for a lot of folks. And it's very interesting and ironic that that area relied on cutting the redwood trees and logging that, and then afterwards brought in tourism to enjoy the area after the trees were cut. And it fascinates me how each pioneer at Quail Hollow was able to become very successful in a fairly short amount of time by being able to cater to the times as they were changing so rapidly.
Well, they went from nurturing watermelons in the 1870s to nurturing dreams in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. It's a very interesting fits Santa Cruz in some way. We've always been a town that has imagination, dreams on the cutting edge of everything. And it's hard to imagine that old stodgy Sunset magazine was once cutting edge, but in the 1950s, that's what people read to get ideas back in Nyack, New York, about entertaining.
Well, that's also interesting because you wouldn't read that in Nyack, New York, because Sunset Magazine wasn't sold east of the Rocky Mountains. Larry Lane refused to sell
Coors
it.
beer.
That's exactly right. If you lived in New York, you don't deserve this magazine, was his attitude. And it was about Western living, and he catered to people who moved to the West Coast. He had no patience for people on the East Coast.
Now, here's the extraordinary thing, dear listeners, is that the house, if you hit it on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, if you're lucky, Richard James will be there, or if not Richard, someone who knows not as much as you do, but certainly can do a capable tour. And you can walk through this model kitchen. You can walk through the house. You see the wallpaper, the original house. And this is where the time portal thing gets eerie. And that's why when I walked through and met you, I said, ooh, I need to talk to you about this on the radio. I almost don't want to spoil it because I don't want a lot of people tromping around there. But on the other hand, this place needs to be supported. So
It's a great facility in that it's been preserved, and our pioneers and the way the property ended up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was huge in being able to preserve this piece of property the way it is.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm often wrong about these things, but the dread Prop 13 that kind of eviscerated so much in the state ultimately, that cut so much revenue from coming into the state and led to such hard times for a lot of different areas, actually saved Quail Hollow from, if not destruction, but from a very different kind of place that would have nowhere near the charm, or it certainly would have paved over the time portal.
Absolutely right. I mean, Santa Clara Board of Education purchased that property in 1960-something, I believe, 70-something, forgive me. And they were going to change it into a satellite teaching campus for the school system in Santa Clara. And Prop 13 passed, and they weren't able to come over there. But I was looking over some of their plans.
They were going to knock all. Yeah, what were the plans?
That's exactly right. Their plans were going to change things around, build dormitories, build science labs, knock down perhaps the stable area, change the house around. Had they been able to fulfill their dream, that property would be much different than what it is today.
Well, it's again, I find really interesting about this is it somehow fits Santa Cruz too. This is a sort of magical place that has been perfectly preserved. And if more people went there, or some things had shifted just a little bit, it might not be the same thing. You know, on one hand, you need all the money you can get to restore and keep the house going. But on the other hand, the fact that people haven't paid as much attention to it as they should have left it in this really wonderful sort of as it was state. I'm fishing here, but it just struck me as this great balance where right now you can come up and sort of see it before it gets done. You know, somebody says, oh, well, let's put the 3D terrarium in the theater over here and let's make it a interactive exhibit. I mean, my favorite thing is you have a stuffed cougar, a stuffed cougar with authentic cougar scat. Is this true?
That's very true.
It's my favorite museum exhibit in the world, I think. It's the authentic cougar scat where did the cougar scat go?
It was a tough decision. We had a neighbor of the park come by long after that taxidermy animal was displayed, and he brought in, it was fresh, unfortunately, the day he brought it in, and said he had on his telephone a video of the animal actually doing what he did, and he brought it in, and I talked to other docents and people around us, and we thought it was very important to display that with our cougar. We have that mountain lion, or that type of animal, lives in the park today. We have a healthy herd of deer. With that healthy herd of deer, we probably support 1 or 2 lions hunting on a regular basis through that park. And it's important if you're a hiker, and we do get a lot of apprehension from folks that are not used to the wild necessarily, about walking in a park where it is known that there are mountain lions. So I thought it was important to display something like that. If you're walking a trail looking down, see scat, well, it might ring a bell and say, well, maybe I should look up a hill or look around a little closer before I proceed on.
And part of the joys of the hikes is, I think I pulled this from somewhere, there's 41 different varieties of trees there, including a sequoia.
Yeah, absolutely right. We have a Sequoia giganteum there, which is not a normal tree in our area of California. It was probably planted, well, actually, I have photos of that area where that tree is growing now without that tree, and the photo dates to around 1928, 29, maybe.
Oh, so it's it's a Christmas tree. That's
Right. I think it was brought in. My thinking is it was perhaps brought in by the Lane family when they purchased the property and planted as a small tree in 1937, 38. It's not doing as well as it would in its normal environment. It's not getting the moisture that it needs. The sandy soil we have is probably not as beneficial as it could be to that tree.
But it's a big tree.
It's a big tree indeed. And we're very lucky. I mean, we've got the park encompasses 10 biotic zones. If you walk on our trails, you'll pass through not easily identifiable, but 10 zones of distinct types of plant life that you won't see probably in many other places. And another thing is, it's one of the last remaining, if not the last remaining, sandhills environment that's open to the public, that's been unquarried and basically unchanged. Granted, it's been ranched and farmed, but the lay of the land, the topography is probably pretty much the way it was when the Ohlonies were hunting and gathering there.
Again, that's interesting because you don't have the big trees, and it just escaped the eye of Sauron to develop it. It didn't get developed. Then when it was going to be used for the Santa Clara schools, which one would argue, well, that's fine, that's a valid use of the land, but dodge that bullet. And then from then, what have been in the last, say, 30 years? Have there been any kind of climactic things, or has it just been in stasis, or
it's been in stasis. It's been kind of, it became a county park in 1986, and prior to that, Santa Clara Board of Education had it. But just prior to that was a cattle rancher named Harry Owen from Hayward, California.
And he bought it from the Lanes?
He bought it from the Lanes, and he was open ranging cattle there. And it was just about the time in the 60s to 70s when feedlots were coming into style as a more efficient and effective way to raise cattle. And Harry was paying an extreme amount of taxes for the property, he felt, and he wasn't making the money in cattle raising that he thought he would. But the one key factor with Harry and Maud Owen was that he refused to sell that property to developers or anyone who wanted to carve it up. It goes as one piece, it stays as one piece, and this is part of my arrangement, and I won't sell to anyone else. And he was inundated with developers that wanted to carve out small chunks for apartments and houses. We even had application for a small golf course on that property.
Yeah,
and right, it would have probably bulldozed a lot of those sand hills down and changed that property that we probably wouldn't even recognize it today. Harry was very instrumental in saving that property and salvaging what we see today.
This is Exploring Santa Cruz with Erik Nelson and Quail Hollow Park docent Richard James. And we're talking about this, taking a magical history tour, if you will, through this amazingly, inadvertently, now vertently preserved. And speaking of vertent preservation, how did who got it, who grabbed it in Santa Cruz, and how confident are we that it's going to stay as it is, if not, maybe some paint on, some slight restoration, but is this treasure in any danger right now, as far as you can see?
The only danger we see is unfortunately the deterioration of the house, and we're working on this with the county of Santa Cruz, with the parks, to maintain this house. And we're going to have upcoming meetings, as a matter of fact. Interesting that you should mention this, to determine what it's going to take to bring that house back to usage that we'd like to see it. Probably nothing will change in the house. It's protected historically. It's owned by Santa Cruz County Parks. It's probably not going to change hands for any foreseeable future, and I doubt there'll be any modifications. It's an historical entity, and it's going to be preserved the way it is. What we need to do is make sure it's safe and sound, roofs don't leak, E-systems work, the electrical it's always been in the house is going to be working, things like that. And I think that's what the emphasis is going to be from the county park system, and keeping this house together and making it more of a historical entity for the community.
Well, the part of why I wanted to speak with you about this here is that, awareness is part of this. This is something that we all, as Santa Cruz citizens who pay taxes, don't own, but we have the rights to go there. It's our private park. Stay away, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. This is ours. And it strikes me that the work that needs to be done, $100,000 or a great restoration contractor or some local community people who wanted to kind of rehabilitate this treasure could come on down, and there'd be an avenue for that. Is it?
Absolutely right. We're working currently on grants and situations where we can garner enough money to get this done. And I know the Santa Cruz County Parks are working diligently to try and preserve this property. It's kind of gone full circle. When Santa Cruz County purchased this property and developed it as a park in 1986, we were allowed to vote on how the park was going to turn out. And some of the programs and ideas were to perhaps level the park out, bring in ball fields, soccer pitches, playgrounds, perhaps. The majority of the people in the county voted against that. And at the time, I don't think it was really clear that Santa Cruz saw this as an historical entity. But through the years, in the past 30 years since we've owned this park, it's come full circle into being more and more realized as a very valuable historical entity in the Pioneer Resources Department.
But you sell out in a wonderful way, and I mean this with all due respect. You can do weddings there, right? Tell me about that. Like, how much does it cost? I'm not planning on getting married in the near future, but folks, if you're thinking about it, go your scouting expedition. This is a wonderful place. You can step back into 1937 and do something really old school.
Absolutely. I'm not currently privy to the rental amount. What I suggest is people go to scparks.com for any information on volunteering or information about the park. Or you can also, if you want a little more detail about the park, visit friendsofquailhollow.org. That's our nonprofit that helps support the park. Both of the entities I just mentioned are very valuable as far as information goes, and you visit those websites, you'll have a complete feel of what you can do there, what it's going to cost, and what you can accomplish if you want to rent that space.
And if you want to get there, first just Google Quail Hollow. That's it takes you everywhere you need to know. And there's some great articles. That description of the stagecoach rides from Ben Lomond to the boardwalk and back in time for dinner comes from this great historical monograph. Who wrote that? Because that's a great piece. There's a long article on Quail Hollow in one of the websites.
I'm not sure who wrote that one. We usually refer to our docent manuals and things that have been pre-produced for us. So I'm not privy to exactly the names of the people that wrote specific articles about the property.
But it's all out there, folks. And if you want, and most importantly, if you want to get there, it's basically take Zianti Road, up Zianti Road, like you're heading over the hill, hook a right on Quail Hollow, a left on Quail Hollow, and then it's a tricky. The great thing and the difficult thing is it's a tricky entrance. You see a sign, and then there it is. It's a tiny little wooden arch, and you go through on one side, and then you're in the right place when you start coming down and you see this magnificent oak tree. How old is that oak tree? That tree is just incredible.
It's interesting. When the Lane family purchased that property, Bill Lane, Larry Lane's son, overheard his mother complain about that ugly, damaged tree and wanted it cut down. And Larry Lane absolutely refused to do it, said, let that tree grow. It's going to eventually be beautiful. So that tree was saved from, during the Lane era, from Ruth Lane having that tree cut down and taken away.
Yeah, and I think Tim Robbins in Shawshank Redemption hid something under a stone for Morgan Freeman to find under that tree. It has that same sort of magical connotation. Well, Richard, thank you very much. It's time for both of our boot heels to be wandering. Once again, Google Quail Hollow, but give that web address again so people can pitch in and, of course, get directions and everything you need to know.
Right. You can visit scparks.com for an overall view of all the parks. And also, we're constantly looking for volunteers in the park system. So if you feel like you have the time and the wherewithal to volunteer, please visit parks.com and peruse their volunteer section and raise your hand like most of us did. And if you want specific information, friendsofquailhollow.org. Thank you.
Thank you. This is KSQD Santa Cruz. In just a few seconds, it's going to be time for Tom Hartman.